Okay, so what do we mean when we say interactive digital narrative? Well, an interactive digital narrative, or IDN, use that acronym, is essentially an expressive narrative form that makes use of digital media to tell a story, and there's usually some element of participation, okay, on the part of the reader or the interactor. That's the term that Murray likes to use, interactor. A multiform story is very similar. It's a story in which there are multiple potential storylines. So a great example of that would be La La Land, the movie. Now that I think about it, my mother-in-law mentioned that to me. So I don't know if you've seen the movie La La Land, but as you get toward the end, toward the last part, you kind of drift into an alternative reality where the main character is married to someone else and meets the male lead, whose name I forget, in his bar. You might also be familiar with Back to the Future. In particular, the second movie of that trilogy made use of multiple storylines. So you had multiple Martys. You had Marty playing on the stage during the high school dance. You had Marty trying to steal, at the same time he was trying to steal back the almanac, right? And I think you had Marty fighting Biff in the parking lot. So you had multiple parallel storylines. That's something that IDNs tend to excel in. Okay, so let me just check my notes because there are a couple of things I wanted to touch on in this. Jorge Borges' story, The Garden of Forking Paths. So you read that this unit. That's a great example of a multiform story, because at the heart of that story is this mysterious novel written by it's an ancestor of Dr. Sons, right? A relative of Dr. Sons. And this mysterious book is in the possession of Stephen Albert. And that book discusses how the notion of pullulating time, where there are multiple alternative pathways. So time extends like a web of potentialities. And even as Stephen Albert, if you'll recall in the story, even as Stephen Albert is recounting this to Dr. Sun, Dr. Sun starts to become aware of time pullulating around him and these multiple alternative parallel realities extending all around him. And he becomes particularly sensitive to it as he's about to murder Stephen Albert. So that's an interesting story. I think it's very useful. The reason I assigned it at the very beginning here is it offers a way for us to start to think about what multiform stories do. And of course, the digital platform, a digital environment, offers a really it really leverages the power of being able to explore this. Hypertext in particular offers writers the ability to send readers on a variety of trajectories. Okay, I wanted to talk about that. And really, this one of the things that Murray brings out in the readings you're doing this unit is how we are drawn to this idea of multiple paths, right? The path less the road less traveled. We're fascinated as a species to think about what would have happened if I had chosen X instead of Y. You know, what if I had said yes instead of no? I think that's something that really gets to the heart of what we're interested of ourselves as a species and what we're interested in. Okay, so as I said, hypertext does offer an ideal method in which to explore this. I want to talk a little bit about the three waves of IDNs. So scholars divide the history of interactive digital narratives into three waves, beginning in the mid 60s with Eliza, and you're going to be playing with that interactive game, I guess you could call it, this unit. I don't really think of Eliza as a narrative, and as you start exploring that, I think you'll see why. She was really conceptualized as a Rogerian therapist her algorithms are designed to respond to the questions and statements of the user and kind of reflect back in an empathetic or interrogatory way. So she will ask questions back at you as you give statements. And it sort of lends the facade of an empathetic listener. That was an exploration or experiment in artificial intelligence by MIT researcher Joseph Weizenbaum, right? I think I got that name right, back in the mid-60s. But that foray into AI led to the development of some interactive games. And so also originating from MIT, the game Zork appeared in the late 70s. And you're also playing with Zork in this unit as well. As you start playing with Zork, you'll see very quickly that it is a narrative. You are creating a story, and you are one of the protagonists in the story. You're exploring this sort of mysterious world. You're in a forest. There's a white house. You can go into the house. There are objects that you can pick up and take with you and use as you go on this adventure. So this first wave of IDNs was text-driven. It was primarily, it did not make use of graphics. It was typing in commands, and that's how you navigated it. The second wave so that first wave extended through the 70s, I would say, and maybe into the early 80s. Second wave picked up, and in the, I guess, mid or late 80s and into the 90s. And the second wave of IDNs was really distinguished by the use of hypertext. So hypertext, and I know I'm sure you know what a hyperlink is. We use it online all the time. It's that you hover your mouse over a word or a phrase or even an image. You can click on it and you're taken to a new lexia, a new screen. So it was during the 90s that writers really started to exploit hypertext to develop what we would call, or create what we would call, really literary narratives. These are stories that had real depth. They were exploring human nature and human situations in a way that we associate with literary fiction. So examples of that would be Michael Joyce's Afternoon, Shelley Jackson's Patchwork Girl, Stuart Malthrope's Victory Garden. And you may have noticed that I have assigned none of those in this course. Why? Because the technology no longer is supported by most browsers or computers. They relied heavily on CD-ROM as the medium, and they were published by Eastgate Systems. You can still go to Eastgate Systems and you can buy a CD-ROM. Some of them have been translated into or transferred onto USB sticks for the Mac. I did have Shelley Jackson's Patchwork Girl on CD-ROM when I was in grad school, but I cannot rely on it as being something that all students can use because it's just antiquated technology. That is one of the problems with IDNs, and we're going to talk more about that later in the semester. But there is a fragility there's a temporality to them. They are reliant on technology that can change and has changed very, very rapidly. Consider that situation. Compare it to, let me just reach this, compare it to this. This is my husband's copy of Don Quixote. I said Don Juan, didn't I? Don Quixote by Cervantes, which was written 400 years ago. And we're still reading it today, right? We're still reading it today. It's in a print form, random access, right? You can pick up anywhere in this book and start reading, but it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So even though you have random access in the form of a print codex, right? you still need to read it in a linear sequential way. It's designed to start on the first page and you page through. Okay, that's a little sidetrack. Let's go back to second wave. Second wave IDN characterized by hypertext, a more literary approach to storytelling, but limited in terms of the availability as technology changed. The third wave, really, I would say third wave started with the advent of Web 2.0, or maybe a little bit before that. So I'd say early 2000s, and you start to see much writers move away from hypertext. So hypertext is really not the dominant form. And I would say this is the era, and we're still in it, the era of a real blossoming of IDNs as art forms. In fact, some of the IDNs, some of the third wave IDNs we're going to look at are, you could almost approach them as interactive art installations. I mean, we have really sophisticated meldings of video, graphics, graphics being both photos and artworks, sound and text. And all of these come together to explore themes in very interesting and intriguing ways. Interactivity changes too. With hypertext, of course, we're clicking through. You click through the links and then you can sometimes go back. Some of the IDNs that use hypertext make use of a menu page, Sunshine 69 that you're going to be reading next unit. You have a home page you can come back to, and you can kind of get some sense of navigation that way. Navigation really changes with third wave. So, for example, because with third wave IDNs, we now have touchscreen technology, you can be using your touchscreen to walk yourself through an abandoned house, for example, as in the story game Gone Home. You can be using a computer controller, I'm not a gamer, or you can be using your mouse to walk through an office building, as in the Stanley Parable. You can explore an island, and some of the graphics are really remarkable. So stories change with third wave. That being said, we are still seeing some really interesting works come out of hypertext. And we're going to be looking at some of them. But there's more, the visual elements have really come a long way. The visual elements are much more sophisticated compared to some of the earlier second wave. Okay, so third wave, early 2000s, and a real, really wonderful development in terms of IDNs as works of art or interactive artworks, interactive art installations. Okay, where am I going now? I gotta stop and think. What else did I want to talk to you about? Okay, let me just talk a little bit about how to approach some of the stories. Beginning with next unit, you're going to have an array of IDNs to explore. I tried to select stories that are readily available online and that demonstrate one or more features that some of our assigned readings are explicating. So, for example, Murray offers 4 elements of computers as a storytelling media. We're going to be looking at some other frameworks, and the stories that you're going to be exploring offer examples. Your role as a reader, you'll notice very quickly that you cannot follow the same kind of traditional reading habits that you expect in, for example, a classic short story like Elizabeth Tallant's, the Elizabeth Tallant story you read in this unit. It really calls upon you to construct the narrative. I should say IDNs really call upon you to do some hard work, do some figuring out of what's going on. You, as a reader, have to do non-trivial work, as Espen Aarseth says in his book Cybertext. non-trivial work in putting the narrative together and figuring out the story. So I would tell you now, do not approach stories like Sunshine 69, I mentioned that, Gone Home, These Waves of Girls, some of these stories that you're going to be reading in upcoming units. Do not approach them with the same mindset that you would approach a traditional text like Don Quixote. With Don Quixote and other similar texts, look, I've got Mrs. Dalloway here. I just happen to have Mrs. Dalloway sitting here. Wonderful book. Fragmented narrative as well. But you start at the first page and you page through, right? And there is, the story will follow a linear, sequential, well, not Mrs. Dalloway, that's not a good example, but most traditional stories follow a linear, sequential narrative trajectory. And the story is basically given to you. And certainly you're making sense of it. You're bringing your own filter, your own background, your own experience to it. But the story that you get will be not terribly different than the story your friend gets if they happen to read it. When it comes to IDNs, and in particular some of the branching hypertext stories we're going to be reading, your story may sound, the story you get may be quite a bit different than the story I get, or the story somebody else gets. And to me, that's part of the enchantment of this type of narrative. So you're going to also, well, let me just take a step back. I said that this is part of the enchantment of this. I want to share something with you that Murray says, a little quotation from Murray. If I can, I had it right here. I had pulled it out to share it with you. Yes, so this is what Murray says on page 28 of chapter 1. You're going to be reading this in this unit. She says, the hollow novel, so she's using the holodeck, right, as sort of the metaphor. The hollow novel, the equivalent novel form, IDNs, offer a model of an art form that is based on the most powerful technology of sensory illusion, but is nevertheless continuous with the larger human tradition of storytelling. I want you to keep that in mind, especially as you start to maybe feel a little frustrated with the opacity of some of these stories that we're going to be encountering. As these utopian and dystopian fictions remind us, so she's referring to the holodeck as the utopian and the Feely. Remember, she refers to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, the Feely that the protagonist, the savage encounters. As these utopian and dystopian fictions remind us, we rely on works of fiction in any medium to help us understand the world and what it means to be human. So I would like you to approach these stories, beginning with next unit, just in that way. They're not necessarily easy, but they offer us one more way of understanding the human condition. And I think as well, you will end up enriched when it comes to reading traditional print narratives as well. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I've talked too long, and I will see you in the discussion forum.